Harold Brodkey was born on the 25th of October, 1930, in Staunton, Illinois. After his mother's early death, he was adopted by relatives in St. Louis and raised in a household shadowed by emotional volatility and an abusive stepfather. Those early wounds became the raw material for a literary voice that would obsessively map the hidden currents of memory, desire, and selfhood. He graduated from Harvard in 1951, and by the 1960s, had established himself as one of the most singular and demanding prose stylists in American letters. His stories in The New Yorker were famous for their luminous, almost microscopic attention to the movements of consciousness. His long-awaited novel, The Runaway Soul, was both praised and criticized for its relentless interiority. Brodkey wrote as if the only subject worth examining was the self in all its restless, contradictory glory. By the early 1990s, he was living in New York with his wife, the writer Ellen Schwam. In the spring of 1993, he was diagnosed with AIDS, a moment that forced his lifelong preoccupation with the self into direct confrontation with its own ending. Harold Brodkey did not describe the diagnosis as a single dramatic emotional break. His response was more consistent with the way he had always written, analytic, inward, and precise. In this wild darkness, he records an immediate shift in awareness rather than a clear sequence of emotions. The diagnosis collapses abstraction. Time, which had previously felt open and expandable, becomes sharply bounded. He becomes acutely conscious of duration, how long things take, how much remains, how attention itself changes when the future is no longer assumed. There is fear, but it is not expressed as panic. Instead, it appears as heightened observation. He examines his own reactions almost clinically, the body as something both familiar and increasingly unreliable, the mind as something trying to stay coherent while anticipating decline. He resists sentimentality and avoids framing himself as brave or tragic. A recurring thread is control through language. Writing becomes a way to stabilize experience. By describing what is happening internally, sensations, thoughts, distortions of time, he maintains a sense of agency. The act of articulation replaces emotional release. He also notes a form of estrangement. The self he had spent decades analyzing is now under threat, and that creates tension. He is both the subject and the observer of his own deterioration. This dual position intensifies rather than resolves his inner life. There is no clean acceptance. Instead, there is sustained attention. He continues to track the mind as it adjusts to the fact of death, how it resists, reframes, narrows, and occasionally clarifies. In effect, the diagnosis does not change his focus. It removes any distance from it. What followed was not a conventional illness narrative. Over the next 2.5 years, Brodkey produced a series of essays for The New Yorker, later gathered in the slender, merciless volume, This Wild Darkness, The Story of My Death, that constitute one of the most rigorously philosophical and introspective accounts of a mind confronting its own extinction ever committed to paper. He did not reach for transcendence. He did not offer redemption or heroic defiance. Instead, he trained the full, merciless precision of his literary intelligence on the slow unraveling of his own consciousness. The result is less a story than a sustained philosophical meditation on what happens to the self when the body begins its irreversible retreat and the future collapses into a handful of months. From the first moment of diagnosis, time itself became alien. When you learn you're fatally ill, he wrote, time becomes very confusing, perhaps uninteresting, pedestrian. The ordinary texture of anticipation drained away. The future, once an open field for ambition and fantasy, simply evaporated. Moments lost their depth. They became extraordinarily dimensionless, not without value, but flat and a great deal emptier. Days no longer felt like something he moved through. They felt like something that was happening to him, a slow, indifferent current carrying him toward an end he could see but could never fully inhabit. Equally devastating was the injury to the ego. Brodkey had always possessed a towering literary self-regard. Now that same ego turned its razor gaze inward and recoiled. "I felt too conceited to have this death," he confessed. The illness struck him as ill-judged, almost beneath the complexity of the mind that had spent decades dissecting the subtlest movements of thought and feeling. Death, he observed with a kind of detached horror, was a small, tightly defined pedestrian event, in contrast to the immensity of God or the universe, banal, biological, without miracle or instruction. The ego, which had always believed itself the hero of its own story, now found itself demoted to a minor character in a narrative it could no longer control. As the disease progressed, he watched the self he had spent a lifetime constructing begin to dissolve. The literary voice that had defined him, the poetry, the style, the luminous precision, started to desert him. All sense of presence, all sense of poetry and style, all sense of idea left me. It was gone, with not one trace, one flicker remaining. He described the experience as like visiting one's funeral, like visiting loss in its purest and most monumental form. This wild darkness, which is not only unknown, but which one cannot enter as oneself. Identity itself, he concluded, had always been something of a game. No one belongs entirely to nature, to time. In the face of death, the game ended, and what remained was a mind still lucid enough to observe its own erasure. Yet even in that wild darkness, Brodkey kept writing. The act of recording became his final defiant assertion of selfhood. He refused every comforting illusion, spiritual, heroic, or sentimental. He did not pretend that dying brought wisdom or peace. He simply refused to look away from the confusion, the boredom, the ego's wounded protests, the flattening of time, the slow chemical suffocation of the disease. "Death is a bore," he wrote at one point, "but life isn't very interesting either." There was no final revelation, only the stubborn, almost painful honesty of continuing to see clearly while the light inside the skull began to dim. He died on January 26, 1996, at the age of 65. Brodkey's unflinching record presses close with a rare and unsettling clarity. When the diagnosis arrives and the body begins its quiet, methodical betrayal, most of us instinctively reach for stories that soften the terror. Stories of courage, of meaning discovered in suffering, of peace at the end. Brodkey offers none of those consolations. Instead, he insists on staying inside the confusion, the banality, the ego's indignant protests, the slow erasure of the self that once felt so permanent. He shows us that the final act of consciousness may not be heroic or transcendent. It may simply be the stubborn, almost painful act of continuing to observe, to notice how time flattens, how identity frays, how the mind keeps working even as it senses its own approaching silence. In that refusal to look away, in that merciless honesty about the wild darkness that waits for every one of us, Brodkey leaves behind something quieter than hope and more enduring than illusion, a precise, unsentimental record of what it actually feels like to be a human mind when the story is almost over and the self that told it is beginning at last to let go.